Every Halloween, me and my friends hit the same neighborhood. It's a small town, so by now we know every single house that gives out the best candy and which ones to skip. You know the houses, the ones with no decorations, dark windows, and a grumpy owner who acts like Halloween is a crime. We've got the route memorized by now, except for one house. There's this huge old Victorian on the edge of town, half hidden behind big trees, with a rusted iron fence around the yard. It's been empty as long as I can remember. Windows always dark, yard overgrown. People say it used to belong to some old lady years ago, but she either moved out or passed away. No one really knows, and no one trick-or-treats there. It's just always been empty. But this year as we walked down the street, we noticed something different. The house was decorated. Actual decorations, like someone had gone all out. There were jack-o'-lanterns lined up along the steps, fake cobwebs stretching across the porch, and a glowing orange light spilling out from the windows. We stopped in our tracks, staring at it. None of us had ever seen that house lit up. It had been dark for as long as any of us could remember. My friend Tommy dared us to go knock on the door. We laughed it off at first, saying it was probably just some prank, or maybe new owners moved in and nobody noticed. But the more we stared, the more curious we got. I mean, if they went through the trouble of decorating, they had to have good candy, right? We walked up to the house, stepping carefully along the cracked stone pathway, and rang the doorbell. For a few seconds there was silence, and I started feeling a little silly, like maybe no one was actually home. But then, the door creaked open, and an old lady appeared, smiling at us. She was dressed in this old-fashioned dress, something you'd see in a black and white movie, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face was pale and her eyes sparkled, like she was genuinely happy to see us. She said, "Well, aren't you all just darling? Come in, come in. I have some special treats for you." I glanced at my friends, and we all hesitated. Something about her felt off. But it was Halloween, and we didn't want to back down from a dare, so we stepped inside. The house was like stepping into a different time. Old furniture, dusty paintings on the walls, and this musty floral smell that hung heavy in the air. Everything looked worn, like it hadn't been touched in years. She led us to a table in the living room, where a big bowl of candy sat. They weren't the usual store-bought wrappers we were used to. They were wrapped in strange, patterned paper, almost like they were handmade. She smiled and told us to help ourselves, saying it was her favorite time of year as we each took a piece. She started talking, asking us about our costumes, our favorite Halloween memories. Her voice was soft, and her eyes had this faraway look, like she was seeing something from years ago. At one point, she even mentioned my costume from last Halloween. Something I knew I hadn't told her about. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I brushed it off, figuring maybe one of my friends had told her. Still, the air felt thick, like we weren't supposed to be there. We left pretty quickly after that, saying our thank yous and trying not to look too eager to leave. She waved us off, standing in the doorway with that same soft smile, watching us until we reached the end of the yard. I looked back once, and I swear her eyes were still locked on us, like she didn't want us to leave. The next day, curiosity got the better of us, so we decided to go back and check out the house again. I wanted to see if it still looked the same, or if it had all been some elaborate Halloween prank. But when we reached the street, the house was back to the way it always was: dark, quiet, overgrown. The jack-o'-lanterns were gone, the lights were off, and it looked just as abandoned as it always had. We walked up to the door and knocked, but there was no answer. It felt like no one had been there for years. That's when Tommy spotted something on the doorstep. A newspaper yellowed with age, dated from over 30 years ago. We exchanged nervous glances trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. One of the neighbors happened to be outside, an older guy who'd lived in the area forever. We asked him if anyone had moved into the old house. He gave us a funny look and told us that no one had lived there in decades, not since the original owner, Mrs. Holloway, passed away. My stomach dropped as I remembered the old lady's smile, her distant eyes, and the way she seemed to know things about us. None of it made sense. When we got home, I emptied my candy bag, feeling more unnerved than ever. And there, at the bottom of the bag, was a single piece of that strange candy she had given us, wrapped in faded paper with an old pattern. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if any of it had been real at all. But as I held that candy, I could still smell the musty floral scent hanging in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. There was something. I've always loved Halloween, but last year changed things for me. It was the first Halloween where I felt hunted. The night started out normally enough. I'd been hanging out at my friend Eric's house for a little Halloween get-together, eating candy, watching scary movies. We were all in costumes, but as midnight got closer, people started heading home. I had planned on staying over, but I realized I'd left something at home I needed for the next morning, so I decided to walk back. It was late, but my house was only a few blocks away, and the streets were still busy with Halloween energy kids in costumes, groups of teenagers, people laughing and shouting. But about halfway down the block, I noticed someone standing on the corner ahead of me. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was dressed in this ridiculous pumpkin suit, like one of those full-body costumes with a big grinning pumpkin head. He was just standing there perfectly still, like he was waiting for something, or maybe someone. I thought it was funny and kept walking, figuring he was just another Halloween weirdo. But as I passed him, I felt his gaze on me. Even though I couldn't see his eyes through the pumpkin head, I knew he was staring. I brushed it off, kept walking, but when I looked over my shoulder, he had turned to watch me go. My pace picked up, the fun Halloween energy starting to fade a little. I told myself he was probably just messing around, but something about him felt wrong. A few blocks later, I saw him again. This time, he was standing under a streetlight, just ahead of me, facing me as I approached. I felt my stomach drop. It didn't make sense. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me unless he knew a shortcut or something. But there he was, perfectly still, pumpkin head grinning. I crossed to the other side of the street, keeping my eyes forward, acting like I didn't even see him. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my hands were starting to sweat. I could feel his eyes on me, watching me like he was daring me to look. When I glanced back, he was still there, standing exactly where I'd seen him, motionless, his pumpkin head turned toward me. I started walking faster, almost jogging now, trying to shake the eerie feeling crawling up my spine. I kept telling myself it was just some Halloween prank, that I'd laugh about it tomorrow. But when I turned the next corner, there he was again, closer this time, standing at the entrance to the park near my street. I stopped in my tracks, feeling trapped. The streets were emptying out now, and there was no one around, just me and him. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, each beat louder than the last. I thought about turning around, finding another way home, but I didn't want to look scared. So I walked forward, as casually as I could, trying not to look at him as I passed. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, but I could see him out of the corner of my eye, standing perfectly still, his head tilted slightly, like he was watching me. I didn't look back this time. I just kept walking, feeling the prickling sensation of his gaze burning into my back. Finally, my house came into view, and I felt a rush of relief. I practically ran up the driveway, fumbling for my keys, glancing over my shoulder to make sure he hadn't followed me. There was no one there, no sign of the pumpkin-suited man. I laughed, half nervous and half relieved, telling myself I'd just let my imagination get the best of me. But then, as I opened the front door, I saw him. He was standing in my yard, right at the edge of the porch, his pumpkin head tilted as if he was studying me. He was so close, too close. I froze, gripping my keys so tight I could feel them digging into my palm. He didn't move. He didn't move. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, that twisted pumpkin grin staring back at me. I stepped inside and slammed the door, locking it with shaky hands. I peeked through the blinds, hoping he'd be gone. But he was still there, standing in the same spot, his head tilted up toward the window, like he was waiting for something. I stayed up all night, listening, waiting for any sign that he'd left. When the sun finally came up, I dared to look outside. The yard was empty. No footprints, no sign he'd ever been there. It was like he'd vanished with the night. I don't go out alone on Halloween anymore, and every now and then, when I'm outside late at night, I get the feeling that he's still out there, waiting for the chance to find me again. I was never one for costumes, but this year, I got roped into a last-minute Halloween party. Everyone was supposed to dress up, and I didn't want to be the odd one out. So about an hour before the party, I found myself at a dingy little thrift shop on the edge of town, looking for anything that could pass as a costume. The shop was cluttered with random things, old clothes, mismatched shoes, cracked glassware. It smelled musty, like it hadn't seen fresh air in years. I wandered down a dusty aisle filled with Halloween props, most of them cheap plastic masks and costumes from 100 Halloweens ago. That's when I saw it, tucked away on the bottom shelf, almost hidden. It was a mask, but not like any mask I'd ever seen. The face was twisted into a sinister grin, with hollow eyes that seemed to follow me. It was hand-painted, the colors faded but still eerily lifelike, almost like the mask was watching me. I felt a chill, but I couldn't look away. Something about it drew me in. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It felt heavier than it should, cold to the touch. I didn't want to admit it, but the mask creeped me out. Still, I was in a hurry, and it was the only thing that felt remotely Halloween-worthy. I brought it up to the counter, and the old man running the shop barely glanced at me as he rang me up. When I got to the party, I slipped on the mask, adjusting it until it fit snugly. Right away, I felt different, more confident, but also more aggressive, and I started saying things I'd normally keep to myself. My friends kept giving me these weird looks, like I was acting strange. By the middle of the night, I felt like I was on top of the world. I didn't hold back with the jokes, even the mean ones, and I didn't care if I was a little too loud or a little too intense. At one point, my friend Mark tried to tell me to tone it down, but I just laughed in his face, feeling a thrill from the way he looked so. After a few hours, I was ready to head home. I took off the mask and shoved it in my bag, glad to be done with it. But as I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, I froze. The face looking back at me wasn't my own, it was the mask's twisted grin, staring back at me with those hollow eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. Just me, no mask. I shook it off, figuring it was a trick of the light, or maybe just too much Halloween punch. That night, though, I dreamed of it. In every dream, I was wearing the mask, saying awful things to my friends, pushing people away. I'd see myself in reflections, grinning that sinister smile, and I'd wake up feeling like the mask was still on, like I couldn't escape it. The next day, I tried to brush it off as Halloween nerves, but every time I caught my reflection, I'd see a flash of that twisted grin, the mask over my face, even though I wasn't wearing it. I was starting to feel like I was going crazy. By the third night, the nightmares had gotten worse. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see myself with the mask, taunting people, pushing them, doing things I didn't want to think about. I woke up drenched in sweat, feeling like the mask was still there, fused to my skin, even though I knew it wasn't. It got to the point where I couldn't look in a mirror without seeing that sinister grin staring back at me. I'd rub my face, try to shake it off, but I could still feel it, like a second skin, twisting my expression even when I wasn't wearing it. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the mask, stuffed it in a bag, and drove back to the thrift shop, desperate to get rid of it. The old man was there, same as before, looking like he hadn't moved an inch since Halloween. When I handed him the mask, he just gave me a faint smile and said, "So you're done with it already?" They always end up bringing it back. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I just nodded, handed it over, and walked out, not looking back. After that, the nightmare stopped, and my friends said I seemed like myself again. I avoided mirrors for a while, afraid of what I might see. But eventually, things went back to normal. Sometimes, though, when I pass by that shop, I swear I can see the mask in the window, grinning that same twisted grin, waiting for someone else to pick it up. Every town has its own Halloween legend, right? Ours is the Hollow Man. People say he was some kind of drifter who wandered into town decades ago, a guy with no name, no past, nothing but empty eyes and a hollow smile. The story goes that he vanished one Halloween night, right on the outskirts of town. Some say he was taken, others say he just walked off into the woods and never came back. But ever since then, there's been this local legend that he returns every Halloween, wandering the streets, looking for someone to take with him into the darkness. Growing up, everyone heard the stories. People said that if you chanted his name 3 times at midnight, he'd appear and follow you home, staring at you with that empty look, waiting for the right moment to pull you into whatever place he disappeared to. Most of us laughed it off, but there was always a part of me that wondered if maybe, just maybe, it could be true. This year, my friends and I decided we were old enough to put the legend to the test. It was our senior year, the last Halloween we'd all be together before going our separate ways, and we figured we'd go out with a bang. So there we were, just before midnight, standing in an old playground on the edge of town. It was the perfect spot for summoning a ghost, a rusty swing set creaking in the wind, shadows stretching across the cracked asphalt, a place that felt like it was made for spooky stories. Jake, my best friend, was the one who convinced us to do it. He stood in the middle of the playground, grinning, and said, "Come on, guys, it's just a stupid story." We all laughed, a little nervous but too proud to back out. Jake started the chant, and one by one we joined in, saying "Hollow Man" 3 times, voices low and shaky. As soon as we finished, the wind picked up, colder than before, sharp enough to make me shiver. We all laughed, trying to shake off the tension, and started walking back home, feeling a bit silly for even thinking it would work. But then, I heard footsteps. They were faint, but distinct, echoing softly behind us. I turned around, expecting to see another group of kids out late, maybe even someone trying to prank us, but there was no one there. Just the empty playground, silent and dark. I tried to brush it off, but every few steps I'd hear them again, a steady, slow pace, like someone was walking just a few feet behind us. I glanced at my friends and I could tell they were starting to feel it too. We were all laughing a little too loudly, trying a little too hard to act like everything was normal, but I could see the nervous looks they were giving each other, the quick glances over their shoulders. About halfway home, we stopped. Jake turned around, looking frustrated, and shouted into the night, "All right, whoever's messing with us, knock it off." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, the kind of quiet that presses down on you, thick and heavy. We stood there, holding our breath, waiting for something to happen. Then, from somewhere behind us, we heard it. A faint, hollow whisper, echoing through the dark. You called, none of us moved. We just stood there, staring into the shadows, hearts pounding, trying to convince ourselves that we hadn't really heard it. Jake laughed, trying to break the tension, but it sounded forced, hollow. He turned to us, saying something about how we were letting our imaginations get the best of us. But as he talked, I saw his face change, his eyes widening as he looked past us. Slowly, I turned around, my heart hammering in my chest. There, just beyond the streetlight, stood a figure. Tall, thin, almost too thin, like there was nothing inside his skin. His face was empty, pale, and stretched into a wide, hollow smile, and his eyes, they were empty, completely black, like pits leading to nowhere. We stood there, frozen, too terrified to move. The hollow man just stared at us, that empty smile fixed on his face, like he was waiting for us to do something. Jake whispered, "Run," and we did. We turned and sprinted down the street, not daring to look back, the sound of footsteps echoing behind us, faster now, closer. I could feel him right on my heels, that hollow gaze burning into my back, the empty laughter following us, filling the night. We didn't stop running until we reached my house, slamming the door behind us and locking it tight. We all sat there in silence, too afraid to speak, listening for any sign that he'd followed us. But there was nothing. Just the quiet and the faint sound of the wind outside. The next morning, Jake didn't show up for school. His mom said he hadn't come home that night. The police searched, but they didn't find anything, no sign of him. No clue where he'd gone. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. The rest of us, we tried to convince ourselves that he'd just run away, that it was some kind of prank gone wrong. But I knew better. I still hear those footsteps sometimes late at night, just outside my window, and I know he's out there waiting. The hollow man found what he was looking for, and I can only hope he doesn't come looking for me next. Halloween night was always my favorite. There's something about going out in costume, the thrill of the night, the chill in the air, the streets full of kids laughing and running. It felt like magic. This year I went out trick-or-treating with my two best friends, Jake and Molly. We hit all the usual houses in our neighborhood, filling our bags with candy, and after a while we decided to wander a little farther, down a few streets we didn't usually visit. We figured we'd find some new houses, maybe even score some full-size candy bars. That's when we came across the house. It didn't look like much, dark, no decorations and no lights on. But right there on the porch was a big bowl, filled with candy, and a handwritten sign that said, "Take one." We all glanced at each other, a little skeptical. The candy was wrapped in these plain black wrappers, no logos, no markings. It was weird, but we figured it was just some person who wanted to do Halloween without the fuss of decorating. Besides, candy is candy, right? We each took a piece, trying not to think too much about it. Then we moved on, forgetting all about the strange houses. We went back to trick-or-treating. Later that night, when I got home, I dumped my candy out on the table to sort through it. My mom always liked to look over what I'd collected, and she raised an eyebrow at the black wrapped candies. "Where'd you get these?" she asked, picking one up. I shrugged. "Some house down on Maple. They just left a bowl out." She didn't seem too worried, so I opened one and popped it in my mouth. It tasted weird. Not bad exactly, but not like any candy I'd ever had. It was sweet at first, but then this strange, bitter aftertaste hit, almost metallic. I tried not to make a face as I chewed. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just this weird heaviness in my head, like I hadn't slept enough. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I'd just eaten too much candy, and went about my day. That night, though, things got weirder. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard whispering. It was faint, just on the edge of hearing, like someone was mumbling in another room. I strained to listen, but I couldn't make out any words. I thought maybe it was my parents, but when I got up to check, the house was silent. I went back to bed, chalking it up to my imagination, but as I lay there I kept hearing it, this faint, steady whispering that wouldn't go away. The next morning I mentioned it to Jake and Molly at school. They both looked at me with wide eyes. "You heard it too?" Jake said, looking freaked out. I thought I was just dreaming or something. Molly nodded, pale as a ghost. I heard it too. It was like voices, but not real words, just sounds. We all stared at each other, starting to feel a little uneasy. But none of us wanted to admit we were scared, so we brushed it off, saying it was probably just Halloween nerves or maybe some leftover sugar jitters. But it didn't stop. Every night the whispering grew louder, closer. It felt like it was right next to me, like someone was leaning over my bed, mumbling in my ear. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, my room freezing, and every time I closed my eyes, I'd see flashes of something in the darkest shadow, a figure just out of sight, something watching me. Then, one night, I had a nightmare. I was back at the strange house, standing on the dark porch. The bowl of black-wrapped candy was there, but this time it was filled with something writhing, something alive. I could see things crawling inside the wrappers, twisting and turning, like they were trying to escape. When I woke up, I could still feel the taste of that candy lingering in my mouth, that strange bitterness. I got up and stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to get rid of the taste. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw something that made my blood run cold. For a split second, I saw a shadow standing behind me, its face twisted in a grin, black eyes staring back at me. I blinked and it was gone, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave. The next day, I told Jake and Molly everything. They both looked terrified, but we decided we had to do something. We couldn't go on like this, and we couldn't keep ignoring it. That evening, we went back to the strange house, hoping to find some kind of answer. But when we got there, the house was dark, quiet, no bowl, no sign, nothing. The yard was overgrown, like it hadn't been touched in years. We went up to the door and knocked, but there was no answer. It was like the house itself was empty, abandoned. We stood there for a while, unsure of what to do, but eventually we gave up and walked home, feeling more lost than ever. The whispering didn't stop after that, but it faded over time, becoming fainter, like it was moving farther away. But every now and then, when I'm alone in my room at night, I still hear it, a faint murmur just on the edge of hearing, like something is calling me back to that house. And I still have one of those black-wrapped candies tucked away in my drawer, untouched. I can't bring myself to throw it out, but I'll never eat it again. And sometimes late at night I swear I can hear it, moving. There was something.